It will just take a moment.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm just checking on my other screen. Okay, can we have one more check, Matt? Is the YouTube link on?
It is now running, yes. Let me just...
Right. Okay, are we ready to go? Matt, can you see the feed? Is that all happening? Yep, perfect. Okay, well, there we are. All the technical stuff is done. So I think this is time to begin officially the event. So welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Dimitra Fimi, and I am co-director of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, the launch of which we are celebrating today. My specialism is on fantasy and children's literature. I've worked extensively on J.R.R. Tolkien, including with his manuscripts. I've published on children's fantasies, especially Celtic-inspired children's fantasy, adaptation, myth, and folklore. In a minute, we will hear from the rest of our core team and from my co-director. But let me, at this early stage in the event, thank you all for joining us tonight. We were overwhelmed with a global interest our centre and this launch event has elicited. Let me also thank the University of Glasgow for giving us the opportunity to expand our teaching, our research and our public engagement activities by establishing this centre, and a special thanks to the head of the School of Critical Studies where this centre is based, Professor Alice Jenkins, for her support and encouragement over many, many years. A few housekeeping things. Those of you that are with us on the Zoom webinar have the option to switch your view to either a gallery view where you can see all the speakers at the same time, independent of who is speaking, or in a speaker view where you tend to see at the center of your screen the person who's speaking at that particular point. Those of you watching on YouTube, I'm afraid this is preset for you. When we're ready to take questions, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. You can use the chat function to register reactions, etc. I've seen that some of you are already sort of sharing chats there, and that's absolutely fine. But when it comes to question, we'll have to stick to monitoring one of those two boxes. So the Q&A is the one where we'll take questions from. And since I mentioned the chat, it would be lovely actually if attendees could post where in the world they're watching us from. Actually, I've seen some of you doing this already out of instinct. And this is the pleasure of an online event, that we can have all of this happening all over the world at the same time. Those of you on YouTube can equally maybe post a comment of where you are watching us, because I do have a sense, and I'd like that confirmed, that we have a global span right now. In a moment, I will pass on the baton to the core members of our centre team for a quick hello, and then eventually to my co-director, who will talk to you briefly about the history of fantasy at Glasgow, i.e. how we got here. Then we're going to be spoiled rotten by listening to the amazing Ellen Kushner giving her keynote, and she will take questions after that. And the last part of the event will be the panel on fantasy with Terri Windling, Professor Brian Attebery, and Dr Robert Maslen. And again, there will be questions during that. So without further ado, let me tag the core team of the centre for a quick hello, and let me begin with Dr. Matt Sangster.
Hello everyone, so I'm Matthew Sangster. I'm a senior lecturer in Romantic Studies, Fantasy and Cultural History at Glasgow. I've published on Mervyn Peake, and I co-curated an exhibition on Peake for his centenary at the British Library a few years back, and on China Miéville and fantastic cities. At the moment, I'm thinking about fantasy and history and community. As part of the program at Glasgow, I teach a course called Fantasy Across Media, and I supervise a number of students, many of whom are in the chat, so I must try and not forget any of their topics, on topics including the Discworld, Lucifer, the Digital Fantastic, Tamara Pierce, fantasy and virtual reality, video game representations, China Miéville, Tolkien and ethics, liminality, fairy poetry, and just recently Dungeons and Dragons.
Excellent, thank you, Matt. Next up is Dr. Rhys Williams.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rhys Williams, and I am a lecturer in energy and the environmental humanities at Glasgow, with a particular interest in fantasy and science fiction and the weird. And I work mainly on how the affordances of these genres are used in real-world discourses, particularly in things like future imaginaries of energy and food and water, and the way that they're essentially used to, well, for political gain often and monetary gain. So that's me.
Excellent, thank you, Rhys. Next one is Dr. Maureen Farrell.
Hi everyone, my name's Maureen Farrell, and I work in the School of Education, principally as a teacher educator, but I have a background in Scottish children's literature. I'm the programme leader for the Masters in Children's Literature and Literacies at the University of Glasgow, and my particular interest in fantasy has to do with Scottish fantasy, as you might expect. I'm particularly interested in the non-human in Scottish children's fantasy, and also in the myriad versions of the Tamlin story and the retellings of Tamlin story. And I'm delighted to be here this evening. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you, Maureen. Next one is Dr. Laura Martin.
Hello, Laura Martin. I'm in comparative literature, where I'm a senior lecturer. My first love was German and English Romanticism, and I started out with the poetry and then the novellas, and that got me into fairy tales and women's writing of the era. So I've written a book about a 18th century German women writer of fairy tales. I'm a Jungian analyst, so I'm very interested in the archetypes of the collective unconscious and living the symbolic life. And I see this as our connection to interbeing, or connection or interbeing to nature. I'm currently co-supervising 2 PhDs on Tolkien, and I've done several magical topics with students in the past, including lit students. My current work is on the gift. So I'm very pleased to be here.
Great, thank you, Laura. And last but not least, or nearly last but not least, because we still have Rob to go, Dr. Matt Barr.
Hi, thanks, Dimitra. So I'm Matt Barr. I'm the other Matt, the lesser Matt in many ways. I'm something of an interloper here, based as I am in the School of Computing Science, although I previously, for my sins, was in the College of Arts. My main contribution to the centre is in the supervision of 3 PhDs, all of which concerned fantasy and video games in some ways. My expertise lies in game studies, but I will stop it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. And now on to my co-director and the one who started everything, Dr. Rob Maslen. I will stop sharing my screen now, and Rob should be able to share his, but Rob, the floor to you.
I'll do my best to share, and we hope this technology will work for me. Hello, my name's Rob Maslen, and I'm the founder of the Emlet in Fantasy at the University of Glasgow. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the journey that led us to this particular point, the founding of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic at the University of Glasgow. So here goes with the screen sharing. Oh, the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. Okay, so I'm currently an attendee apparently, so I will just try this again. Okay, I'm going to share if I can. Yes, I have. Very good, and I apologize for this. Okay. Good, I hope you can all see nicely. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, I hope. Perhaps not. Once upon a time, there was a child who loved to read. He only read stories about things that could never happen, often set in lands or worlds that never existed, full of creatures unknown to science. He liked these stories because he was at boarding school and they took him far away from the life he led there in dormitories and classrooms and corridors made smelling of cabbage. As he got older, he went on reading stories about impossible things, but he did it in secret because such stories were for younger children. He found there were also stories for adults of this kind, often of great beauty and complexity, though people told him that this sort of story was less grown up than other kinds. When he grew up, he wrote a doctoral thesis about stories written in the 16th century. This was considered a serious subject because the stories were old, but they carried him away to lands that felt as if they had been invented, full of magic and strange creatures and vivid pictures painted in delightful words. He got a job at Glasgow University. Later still, he went to America, where he was allowed to teach a course on the books he most liked reading, about things that never existed and never could exist. When he got back, he set up a course exactly like that for undergraduates. His friend Alice Jenkins suggested he set up a master's program to teach the books to graduate students and encourage the world to take them seriously. People like him from all over the world came to study on the program. He hadn't realized how many people there were like him in the world. People who loved thinking about invented places and things and creatures and asking questions about them, such as why they'd been invented, what needs they fulfilled at different times in history, and how they might shape the world we live in. Glasgow University saw how many people were interested in impossible things and created more jobs in the area. He was joined by new companions from places far away and magical to him, such as Greece and Wales and the British Library. The fellowship of staff and students grew quietly from year to year. Together, we invented new ways to share the pleasure of the impossible. Night at the museum, where imaginary people and things took over the Hunterian Museum for an evening. Glasgow International Fantasy Conversations, where more people were invited to join us and talk about books and films and comics and games. A conference for imagining climate change. Fantasy reading parties where we could share the stories, scripts and poems we had written. Symposiums where we plotted events for the future. 5 years after the founding of the Glasgow Fantasy Emlet program, here we are again, setting up a Glasgow Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, designed to make it easier to share ideas and dreams about the impossible with everyone who cares to join in. Perhaps the impossible is not so impossible after all. Perhaps things can really be done with fantasy and the fantastic and to the hearts and minds of people who enjoy such things. Perhaps fantasy and the fantastic can change the way we think of the world or the country or the town or the house we live in. Perhaps together we can build a future where the impossible becomes a template for the possible. Shall we find out? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Rob. That was wonderful. You made us all smile several times. That was great. Okay, amazingly, we're keeping to time. I can't believe this. We haven't got a minute over the planned sort of schedule at the moment, which is brilliant. So we're ready now to move to the next stage, the most awaited for moment of our launch, and this is our Keynote with Ellen Kushner, who I will introduce in a second. Again, just to give you the housekeeping reminder I said earlier on, we will take questions at the end after Ellen finishes, but feel free to start typing them as she goes, and then we will look at them at the end. So don't feel you have to wait until that point, but we will not really read them out until that moment. Okay, so I've got a difficult job to do now. It's difficult to know actually where to start when you're supposed to be introducing Ellen Kushner. Ellen is an award-winning fantasy author, performer, broadcaster, educator, among many other things. Her first fantasy novel, Swords Point, was published in 1987, and it is considered a cult classic which established the fantasy of manners genre and was one of the first to feature LGBT characters as protagonists. Two more novels in what is now the Riverside series followed: The Fall of the Kings in 2002, co-authored with her wife and also award-winning fantasy author Delia Sherman, and The Privilege of the Sword in 2006, as well as numerous short stories and a serialized novel, Tremontaine, set in the same world and co-written and co-produced with a series of other writers. You can find out more in Ellen's website. The Riverside stories have been translated into many languages and are part of an evolving story world. There's always something exciting happening there. May I also recommend the Swords Point audiobook, available now in a new illuminated production with Ellen herself reading the book, supported by a full cast and sound effects, an award-winning audio drama, part of the Neil Gaiman Presents series. I absolutely love that. Ellen's other fantasy novel is the one she will kindly talk to us about today, and I can't wait. That's Thomas the Rhymer, which was published in 1990 and won the World Fantasy Award and the Mythopoeic Award, and was recently reissued in the UK as part of the Golan's Fantasy Masterworks line. The novel retells the story of Scottish laird Thomas the Rhymer, best known from the Scottish Border Ballads and from its reworking by Sir Walter Scott. It draws on folkloric and balladry sources and motifs and is permeated by musical imagery. Neil Gaiman said about it, "Elegant and beautiful, a magical tour de force shot through with strange melodies." I loved it. I loved it too. So it's difficult to stop talking about Ellen. I haven't yet told you about her award-winning national public radio series, Sound and Spirit, aired from WGBH-FM from 96 to 2000, or about her spoken word works and live performances, drawing on Jewish stories, customs, and folklore, or her numerous contributions to fantasy anthologies and workshop. But it's time for me just to stop actually now and actually let Ellen speak, which is the whole point. We are so very privileged to have her with us tonight to launch the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here at the University of Glasgow. Please join me in welcoming Ellen Kushner.
Dimitra, thank you so very, very much. It's really an honor to have been asked. I also want to thank the University of Glasgow for approving this center in the first place, and for recognizing that researching and studying fantasy is important. Also the School of Critical Studies, also at the University of Glasgow, for supporting the Fantasy Masters program that Rob Maslen thought might be a nice idea and which really got everything started. I was privileged to speak there in 2016. I'll talk a little more about that later. The tradition of the fantastic in art and literature is so much more deep and complex than many people realize. So I'm really happy that the center, led by this bunch of knowledgeable and passionate academics, will now exist to benefit everybody and to lead us into the future, which is what Terri and Rob and Brian will be talking about after my talk. As a fantasy writer, I stand on the shoulders of storytellers, stretching back through time. I grew up being read the fantasy classics, Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, The Princess and the Goblins, and of course the 13 Clocks. Then I fell into the great English post-war children's fantasies from C.S. Lewis to Alan Garner. I was very fussy about everything I read being a magic book. And this was beautifully expressed in a book by one of my absolutely favorite writers when I was a kid, the only writer I ever actually wrote a letter to, the American fantasist Edward Eager, in 7 Day Magic, which was published in 1962. Takes place, a bunch of kids in Connecticut, which is basically a giant suburb of New York. It begins, "The best kind of book," said Barnaby, "is a magic book." "Naturally," said John. There was silence as they all thought about this and how true it was. "The best kind of magic book," said Barnaby, leaning back against the edge of the long, low library table and surveying the crowded bookshelves, only seeming somehow to look beyond them and beyond everything else too, the way he so often did, "is when it's about ordinary people like us, and then something happens and it's magic, and you have to deal with it and thwart it before it thwarts you, only sometimes you forget and get thwarted." Everybody began talking at the same time, and the name of E. Nesbit was heard in more than one voice, for she was the 5 children's favorite author, and no wonder. "Why couldn't she have lived forever?" said Abby, taking the best of all Nesbit books, The Enchanted Castle, down from the shelf and looking at it with loving eyes. I have to tell you that I read and reread Edward Eager when I was a kid, and there was no E. Nesbit. I thought they'd made her up, and then found the work of E.S. Nesbit when I was older, and of course now have many copies of all of them. But isn't that a funny way to grow up? I grew up on the 2nd generation, the heir to Nesbit. Barnaby opened his top book hopefully and began chapter 1. But after only a paragraph or two, he leafed over to the back, glanced at the last pages, and shut the cover with a disgusted bang. "I thought so," he said, "of all the cheats. It calls itself the Magic Door, but there's not a spark of real magic in it anywhere. It's just about this boy that learns to get along with these other people by being friendly and stuff. And the Magic Door is just the door of good fellowship or something. Man, do I despise a book like that." Me too. So J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings hit my generation like an atom bomb. We wanted more. Now, our generation of incipient writers had the singular fluke of being initiated into fantasy literature at a time when there wasn't much but the older stuff available. Before the very first wave of Tolkien-influenced writers like Lloyd Alexander and Ursula K. Le Guin came up, publishers were rushing to feed the Tolkien hunger by unearthing the writings of 50 years ago and more. You had these paperbacks of George MacDonald, E.R. Edison, Hope Merleys, Jane Branch Cabell, Lord Dunsany, Evangeline Walton. These quirky writers, who did not know at the time that they were writing anything but quirky books with roots in the fantastic, were the influences on a generation that includes, well, me and Robin Hobb, Charles DeLint, Patricia McKillop, certainly George R.R. Martin, who wrote a lot of very quirky, interesting fantasy before Game of Thrones, Michael Swanwick, John M. Ford, Lisa Tuttle, and of course Neil Gaiman, whose book Stardust is in many ways a loving homage to Blood in the Mist and to Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter. And if you know that when you read Stardust, yay, center, it really deepens your enjoyment of the book. So that's part of our heritage as fantasy writers. Before these authors, way back, are folk all over the world telling stories they'd heard from their grandmothers, passing them on in their turn, and some of them were sung as ballads. You know ballads? Those are those weird narrative poems you find near the beginning of in almost every big collection of English poetry, right between Chaucer and Shakespeare, all attributed to that great genius, anonymous. I first encountered Thomas the Rhymer in my immigrant grandfather, my mother's father's copy of the Oxford Book of English Verse. He's in here right after the Scots, William Dunbar, Scots poet. Oh, wait a minute. No, actually, he's not in here. It must have been in my school poetry anthology. Anyway, it was a mysterious story of a man, a poet, a singer, a minstrel on a Scottish hillside who encounters the Queen of Elfland there. I learned the tune to Anonymous's poem later, one of them, and it goes like this. True Thomas lay on Huntly bank, a fairly he spied with his ee, and there he saw a lady bright come riding down by the Hilton tree. Her gown was of the grass-green silk, her mantle of the velvet fine, on elk-a-tet of her horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. True Thomas he took off his cap and louted low down at the knee, all hail thou mighty Queen of Heaven, for thy peer on earth I did never see. The Queen of Elfland quickly corrects him, tells him she is not the Queen of Heaven, but the Queen of Elfland, and basically dares him to kiss her. He takes the dare, and then she says, harp and carp, Thomas. Harp and carp along of me. The harping, of course, we know, and carping, I think, is now considered what your mom does when you have not done the dishes, but I think it means to chatter. Actually, maybe somebody who knows better than I can pop that into the chat. So off they go to Elfland with some prescriptions on her part, and he's there for 7 years, and then he returns to Earth with some gifts. So I loved this. I loved it passionately, and I always knew that someday I was going to write this story. I would do a story, a book, something about the story of Thomas the Rhymer. I did not, however, expect it to be so soon. I had figured it from when I was older and wiser. Thomas, after all, to me, he's one of the greats in the pantheon of myth. He's the King Arthur of artists. To us, his is the hero's tale that we're most affected by. In his quest, however involuntary his quest may be, this poet goes to the land of myth, armed with nothing but his harp. With the Elf Queen, he takes the bonny road to the source of all magic. He sets his actual feet in the actual realm of myth and story. My novel is told in 4 parts, and I begin the part that Thomas narrates like this. What songs do you sing to them in Elfland? There, where all songs are true and all stories history. Thomas lives in Elfland for 7 years unaging, and when his 7 years in Elfland are ended, he returns to mortal lands, where he actually does meet King Arthur, or one of his archetypes, the King in the Woods. And then we left him standing by the river he could no longer cross, the mortal river that whispered of warmth and old, old battles. And now I heard the songs of all of them, all the songs that ever were sung by the men and women of my own land, heard and understood and forgot them in that journey of days and years and heartbeats. As we began to climb out of the cavern, a breath of chilly air drifted down the dark tunnel towards us. I gasped at its unexpected familiarity, cut into my senses. It was the smell of earth. Thomas brings back truth, but it's a truth that seems like a mere tale to most of the people that he left behind. This is a problem that many of us fantasists are vexed with. Shakespeare talks about this in his great play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, you know, the one with the fairies. Theseus, the king of Athens, finds the 4 lovers at the end of their night's shenanigans with Oberon and Puck, and they're trying to explain to the king what has happened. Hippolyta is sympathetic, but Theseus poo-poos it. He says, I never may believe these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The poet's eye, says Theseus, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And of course, we all know there's a third road, the road to Elfland. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. That's fantasy in a nutshell. It bodies forth the form of things unknown. It gives to airy nothing and local habitation and a name. It concretizes what in the real world does not physically exist. It concretizes metaphor. It names what's under the bed and gives it shape and lets it walk about and speak our deepest secrets and our dreams. Narnia, Westerol, Oz, it gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So I knew it would be years before I would be truly ready to write of Thomas and his journey. Years and years and years, but like the Queen of Elfland, fate appears when it will and caught me up in its arms. In this case, the Queen of Elfland took the form of Terri Windling. It's not the first time Terry's been compared to that queen, but this time the identification came not from her nimbus of dandelion hair, nor her way of seeing directly into your heart when she's talking to you. A hot young editor for a major New York publishing house, fresh off her successful fairy tale series of novels by hot new contemporary fantasists, Terri was ready to do a new series based on ballads. So I just finished my first book, Sword's Point, and I said, if she gave Thomas, I said to her, I said, if you give Thomas to anyone else, I will never speak to you again. Well, that worked. So I knew the folklore and I knew the ballads. And by then I knew how the ballads were sung because my father, also the son of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, became a physician with a lively interest in pretty much everything. So one day he brought home an album by Ewan MacColl, and I still have it, I realized last night, and here it is. This is the album my dad brought home. The Manchester Angel by Ewan MacColl. It just makes me so happy to see it again. And it describes MacColl as Britain's foremost singer of folk songs. Many people associate him chiefly with Scottish songs and modern author-made pieces in a folk manner, but in fact, his skill is blah, 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 blah. So he was an amazing guy. Could do a whole talk on him, and I hope somebody will. He hung out with the traveling people and collected their songs before they could be lost. And he's got this very traditional, to most modern listeners, horrible voice. It's scratchy, it's nasal, and I hated it when I first started listening to this, but I made myself listen anyway because I was so interested in the songs themselves. And then I got used to it, and then it was like goblin fruit. I loved it, and I wanted more. And I sought out lots of other traditional singers, as well as the easier listening of the folk revival that was also going on at the same time. And I collected, with my babysitting money, James Francis Child's 5 volumes of English and Scottish popular ballads, originally done in 1882. And again, this is my actual copy from when I was a kid. And when I thought, oh geez, what's this big piece of paper in here? It's the marker I left for Thomas the Rhymer. And I hope it doesn't crumble into leaves. It's dated, I actually dated it, 8/2, which is in America, August 2nd, 1986. And it's notes I was taking on Thomas the Rhymer when I was writing the novel. So there you are. See, now if this were happening in Glasgow, I would not have brought this to show you. So there are ways in which it's nice that we're doing this on Zoom. So with MacColl and all of his kind, I had the key to the music as well as the words for my trip to Balladland. I was ready to write a book whose plot, subplot, characters, language, and very aesthetic owe everything to border folklore and balladry. Mind you, I'd never set actual foot in actual Scotland when I wrote this book, but I did manage to get there right before the book went into galley proofs. For that journey, my elf queen was the great Jane Yolen, a writer who's been called America's Hans Christian Andersen. She's wonderful. She actually has a place in Scotland now herself. And she invited me to come up with her and to Edinburgh when I was in London and drive up in search of the rhymer. So Thomas is also known as Thomas of Ercildoune. He was a real historical figure. He's listed in documents from 1260 and 1294. So we go up there and we find the Rhymer's Tower Cafe. And I think I better skip the story, even though it's a wonderful story. But thanks to Jane, I was able to breathe the air of the Eildon Hills for myself, to see the Rhymer's tree and a lot of sheep, and get all of that into the book right before it went to press. The red of the upturned earth, the black of the crows against it. and to have some other adventures. The book was published in 1990. My agent was Julie Fallowfield of Macintosh and Otis. So when I had sent her the manuscript to read, I put a copy of the Thomas ballad in because I was worried that if I should be interested. And I wasn't sure if people would need to know the ballad in order to read the book. She called me the next day and she said, "Of course I know Thomas the Rhymer." So that put me in my place. But a lot of US readers didn't know him or didn't know the folklore and gave me undue credit for having made up a lot of really cool stuff that is actually just straight out of Scottish folklore. So Thomas spends his 7 years in Elfland. He's holding his tongue as the queen bids him. The verse in the ballad is, "Now Thomas, ye mun hold your tongue, whatever ye may do or see, for if you speak word in elven land, you'll never win back to your own country." So he returns with the gift of prophecy, the tongue that cannot lie. To me, this is the essence of fantasy, telling the truth. Fantasy is not just made up stuff. The figures gleaned from fairy tale and folklore, ancient myth and romance, the dragons and the wizards, the boggarts and bogles, the selkies and gorgons and witches and elves, the fox maidens and phoenixes. I love them. I'm not putting them down. You can tell. The Garudas, the Tanuki, the Tengu. But the truths these tales must tell about human nature, human folly, and human struggle, it all should be in there. This requirement does not evaporate when it comes to our modern, self-conscious, literary fantasy fiction. Look, I'll say it, there's a lot of bad derivative fantasy fiction out there. It's a business. And not everything we enjoy has to be great art. Some of it can just be competent craft or something just like the other thing we liked. But great fantasy novels tell the truth. It's not a universal truth. I don't actually believe in that. I'm a big relativist. It's the personal truth that only the teller knows. I always tell my writing students, you must speak your own truth and no one else's, especially not that of other fantasists, no matter how much you admire them. You must weave it into your crafting as you body forth the forms of things unknown and give to them a local habitation and a name. Sometimes you learn some unfortunate things about yourself and what you truly believe, but no one said the Bonny Road was easy. As Peter Beagle writes in The Last Unicorn, which is one of my touchstone books, and in fact, this is, again, my actual copy that I actually got when I was 14. It's beat up, but it's got heritage. Peter Beagle has the line that many fantasists just take as our own. Real magic can never be made by offering someone else's liver. You must tear out your own and not expect to get it back. So that's the other thing at the root of Thomas the Rhymer, True Thomas of Ercildoune, and why I intended to spend my life preparing to write about him. Truth. That's not too much to ask, right? I have to say it's kind of intimidating giving this talk before the founders of their center and their colleagues. They're people who know a great deal more about fantasy and Shakespeare, thank you, Rob, than I do. I feel a bit like Bilbo having the cheek to make verses about Arundel in the House of Elfland. And I bet I just mispronounced Arundel, didn't I? I'll say that again. I feel a bit like Bilbo having the cheek to make verses about Arundel in the House of Elrond. But in the end, I remember that, like True Thomas, we writers are not just truth tellers, but also entertainers. J.R.R. Tolkien, I almost forgot to show you, this was my original Tolkien. It was supposed to hold 3 books, but I read them so often and they got so battered that now it holds only 2. Oh, this is the cover to the first one. The cover fell off of my first one. I still have them. They're like my blankie or your teddy bear. I am never letting these go. Anyway, where was I? Tolkien, who could justly be called the founder of modern fantasy in commercial publishing terms anyway, was adamant that he was telling a tale, not trying to preach a grand allegory. Tolkien himself took every single thing he loved, from the Anglo-Saxon tales of which he was a scholar, his love for his wife, Tinuviel, for his love for his friends, living and dead, his religion, his time in the trenches of World War I, through the structure and sounds of all the languages he took such delight in learning. And I have to say, if you ever try to read any Finnish, the hair on the back of your neck stands up because it looks like Elvish, and that is indeed his source for it. He took all of that and he tore it through the iron gates of life, as Andrew Marvell would say, to bring it back to us and tell us the truth that he saw. I just want to add as a parenthesis that I'm not saying you have to be conscious of it. In fact, in some ways it's better if you're not, because you will kind of slide into allegory and question and preachiness if you're aware. But we do write the things that we truly believe in our souls. And absolutely, to my mind, that is where the great fantasy comes from. When you try to manipulate what you believe or what you think you should believe, it does not always work. Trust me. So when I first spoke at the University of Glasgow, it was in November 2016. And I was talking to Dr. Maslen's newly formed MLit in I don't know where philanthropy came from, to Dr. Maslen's new formed MLit in fantasy program. And I was really curious why anybody would think it was useful or necessary to get a master's in fantasy literature. You know, did people want to be academics? Were they just trying to hold off getting a real job? So I asked the students why they'd done it. And to my real surprise, several of them said that they wanted to write fantasy and they knew they didn't know enough about its antecedents. They didn't know the background. They hadn't read the, George MacDonald's and the Sylvia Townsend Warners and what have you. For this, I bless you all. It will not have escaped your attention that my story of fantasy lineage began with folklore and ends rather abruptly with me. Think not that I am not aware that some things have been written since then, things very much worth our marvel and our attention. Truly great fantasy. In the past 30 years, it's been a golden age. And that is coming up on the next panel with Rob and Terri and Brian. But trust me, believe me, I know that you are there. And I count on you, the ones that follow after, to find your way to Elfland and return, bearing with you what you found. Be sure to tell the truth. Thank you.
Oh, and this is the frustration of an online event when we can't have the roaring applause that I'm sure everybody, oh, well, I can see the chat box going completely mad, Ellen. Not that I expect anything else, but that was absolutely beautiful. And how lovely to see the copies of your books with notes in them and the buttered covers. And, as you say, there are some advantages to being able to do that from one's own home, isn't it? Although it would have been lovely to have given you a big hug now. So we can't have everything, it's one of those things. So I can see already lots and lots of questions coming in, but I think I'm allowed to ask the first one because, if I don't use my prerogative now, when the heck am I going to use it? So I wanted to ask about, and you sort of touched upon this a bit, about this push and pull between using a traditional story, traditional material that has all sorts of versions, as with Thomas Verrime, the ballad, the Walter Scott story, the medieval sort of romance, versus the innovation and what you want to do with it that is uniquely yours. And of course, there's a long tradition of doing that all the way back to sort of antiquity, really, of taking myths and folklore and legends and redoing them in a slightly different way. How do you deal with that as a fantasy author today?
I think one thing that's very important is to realize that you're writing a modern novel. And therefore you can do what you want. I mean, this is sort of the short answer. I mean, it has to do with truth. What does the source material mean to you? How do you want to use it? It's just been a big kick to watch, first with Terri Windling and Ellen Kushner doing those, the short story, fairy tale and folklore derived anthologies that they've done so many of, to just see what people come up with. I really think the sky's the limit. I think there's no answer except whatever moves you.
Right, thank you. So that goes all back to truth again, doesn't it? That idea of what speaks the truth to you. Yeah, sorry, Ellen?
No, go on.
Okay, we've got also a question from Rob that I think I'll give him a quick one before I look at everything else. He's asking about the language you use in Thomas the Rhymer, and he says that it's absolutely beautiful. I loved it as well. How hard was it to find the right language for a fantasy novel based in Scotland? You know, you talked about your visit here, about the sort of musical landscape. How about language?
I was very careful about language. I don't do dialect. At least not in terms of, you know, people don't drop their G's and things like that. I use a tiny bit of, you know, words like we, but not a lot. What I really did was I kind of hewed to ballad language, but more to the sentence structure of ballad language than the actual language.
Great. So are you, I mean, I think you've said before that you read aloud quite a bit to yourself as you write, and there is an orality to the way that you write. And that's
I don't actually read it aloud, but I hear it in my voice, in my head.
Yeah.
I mean, everything I write, I hear. I'm a very audio person, not as much of a visual person. And so I'm just naturally, to me, God, I was reading old reviews yesterday in an attempt to remember why this was an important book. And somebody said, I think it might have been Rob even, that I was writing music. And I kind of am. Just the way I hear things when I write.
And a good tag to that, actually, we've got a question, an anonymous question about the music, actually. What helped you decide the music that was going to be in the book, and how did you choose to shape the scenes when Thomas would actually sing?
Opportunism. The songs that I used were things that would advance the mood, the plot, or whatever, or something I particularly loved. The subplot. So when he's in Elfland, the version of the ballad that's best known just drops him there. He goes with the Queen through all of these, you know, rivers and paths, and then he's there, and then the ballad starts up again with him coming back. So the big chunk that I had to invent was, what's he doing while he's there? And I decided, well, steal another ballad. Mm-hmm. And at the time, because Terri was going to be doing this ballad series, I thought, well, I better not pull out from under the nose of possibility anything that someone else is going to want to do. If I basically have taken 2 ballads for my book, that's not fair to the other writers. So I'll do one that I know a novel's already been done about by this woman, Delia Sherman, that I'd met in Boston. It was based on the famous Flower of Serving Men, but her publisher, it was actually the first of one of Terri's, another line of Terri's, the fantasy, what's it called again? Ace Fantasy Special, says Delia, who's over there knitting. Eventually read her, I married her. But her novel is, I think it's still in print, and it's called Through a Brazen Mirror. And boy, does she do interesting things with what that ballad is about. And she really focuses and she does a lot with gender in it, because the ballad is about gender, but also this question of why would a mother do the terrible things that the mother in that ballad does. It's very much a book about toxic mothers.
Great. Just to remind people before I go on to the next question, I am monitoring the Q&A box rather than the chat box for questions. So make sure you put them there and not on the chat box, because I might not see them. The next question was about, and actually there are a couple of them that I'm going to combine because they're mostly the same question, and you sort of started out answering that. How did you choose the other ballads? You've already said that. Are there any other ballads or myths that you are still feel like a tug that you want to address at some point?
Yes. I'm not sure I can tell you what they are because I'm not sure myself, but I love writing my Swords Point novels, but I deeply want to get back to the language and the aesthetic of the ballads.
Excellent. So, well, I think that addresses the 2 questions about ballads. talking about truth then, and coming back to this side, actually, no, let me ask my Elfland question before we go to the more general ones. So you said that the main thing that you had to invent quite a lot was what he does when he's in Elfland, because we don't hear as much there. And I wanted to ask about the sort of the aesthetics of the depiction of Elfland. I was absolutely fascinated by the colors, by the material culture, the clothing, the buildings. You know, and at times I was getting, oh, I know where that comes from, or I know where that comes from. And then there would be bits where I was like, oh, where did she think of that? How did she think of that? So again, how did you think about the world of Elfland as a space? You know, is that the shared space where everything happens, or was that your Elfland?
I don't know. Do you remember what the things were that took you by surprise? I certainly, I through Terri again, but already before I even met Terri, you know, one knew the fairies of Brian Froud and Alan Lee.
I was wondering about that.
And then when she started spending summers where they live and got to be friends with them, I too walked those paths, and it became very, very physical to me. And that was true long before I got to Scotland. Yeah. I'm not sure. Do you have a specific?
I was thinking, I mean, I was getting a feeling of sort of arts and crafts, sort of aesthetics in terms of architecture, but again, that might be me superimposing on your text what I'm seeing.
Well, it is important, I feel, as a highly imaginative, non-visual writer, to leave space for people to picture it. And it may well be that I describe, I don't know, high arches or something, and that mapped for you onto arts and crafts, but I really do love the arts and crafts movement, both in Scotland and here in America. So it's quite possible also that winkled its little way in. Yeah. I mean, you know, everything I write, including the Swords Point books, are basically big stew pots full of things I love. So anything that I think is pretty and feels like Elfland is probably in there.
Fair enough. Okay, I've got a question from Sarah. What truth needs to be told for today's situation of the world, and how can stories guide us back to a truth that'll help us? That's a huge question. That'll help us survive as a species.
Many stories need to be told. That is the God's truth. I mean, I'm going to just bounce back to Tolkien again, because he talks about individual responsibility in a way that I think we've lost. Tell your own damn story, and it will contribute to what we Jews call the healing of the world. That's all. If you sit down to write the story that's going to heal the world, you are, as we say in New York, fucked. Don't do it. You can't. And you will go down the bad road, because you will be trying to make a point, and nobody, I mean, we left children's books that make points behind in, 1860. Let's not do that. Tell your own damn truth, because you individually are important.
Excellent, thank you.
I'm going to mention, by the way, Nora Jemisin, who is a fierce, fierce woman who feels very strongly about her truths. And she manages both to preach in a way, but she's writing so much from her heart, who got in her experience, that it works. Yeah. So I'm not saying you cannot have strong feelings and get them into your book, but they have to be your feelings as well as your intellect. And it has to be something you truly believe. If you do not believe that people of every single color are genuinely equal, you can't write that book. If in your heart, this is what I was talking about, that stuff that can scare you. If you do not believe it with all your heart and soul, there will be a veneer of fakeness to it, well-meaning fakeness. I could go on at length about this. But.
I'm sure you can. You talked, so this was a question about the future, and now there's a question about the past, I suppose, especially the historical or mythical past. Is there something, that's a question from Stefan, is this something that fantasy is intrinsically about in some ways? Is fantasy particularly good at connecting us with the past, either folkloric or historical past?
I think you just answered that question for me. No, it was, I mean, Stefan, brilliantly framed as a question, but I am going to agree with you. Yes, I think it is.
Great. Okay, let me just go through, because I think I'm just.
While you're looking, I just want to, be the good fairy and come out and say, it may sound a little psycho or a little prescriptive to be talking about tell the truth, and if you don't really believe something, it won't come through. Part of what's really exciting about modern writing and modern fantasy is that in our first drafts or our first thoughts, we are often made to confront things that we believe that we don't like. And it is, we are now, I think, all engaged in that delicate tightrope walk of how can I change the way I'm thinking about it, put it into this work and make it good, you know, a force for good without being fake. You know, there's, you have people reading, what are they called again? Security readers, austerity readers, something readers. Thank you, sensitivity readers. Thank you, Delia. I mean, there are many, many ways not to make the world a worse place by telling your truth. And I don't mean to imply that that's not possible.
Great. I have a question from Sandra, who's one of the new Fantasy Lit students, just joined us this September, who is asking about whether you can talk to us about the difference in the process of writing. For example, the difference between Swords Point, where you're inventing your own world, versus Thomas the Rhymer, where you are relying on an enduring mythical tradition. So that's a craft sort of question, I suppose. Yeah,
it is. I mean, to be honest, what I love, Delia and I talk about this a lot. What I love about relying on ballads and fairy tales is you don't have to make up the plot. That's really the thing that I am the most conscious of. But in a weird sort of way, they are both layered the same way. I mean, Swords Point too is just a layering of books I love, stories I love, fantasies I personally have had, on top of like every European country I had ever been to when I started writing that book, you know, and every book I'd ever read. Thomas more so, I say that even though I try to make the characters in Thomas, the human characters, very realistic, they're from Bookland. You know, the lovable old shepherd with his sharp-eyed wife, they're Bookland people. I will say that the Gavin, the old man, also has aspects of my Ukrainian immigrant grandfather in him. But everybody in there is a lot more from Bookland. And Swords Point is to some extent, but I'm really I'm in Swords Point, I'm trying to subvert traditions. This is quotable. In Swords Point, I'm trying to subvert traditions. I'm always surprised when I read it and realize, oh, every single thing I set up is there to be knocked down. Whereas in Thomas, it's the opposite. I'm trying to love and I can't think of the right word. It's not glorify, but you know what I mean.
Cherish.
The opposite of subvert. Yeah, cherish. That's lovely. Yeah.
Great. I'm just conscious of time now. We're going to take a few more. I know there's hundreds of questions and we won't be able to answer everything. I've got a really good one from Ruth, who is one of our DFA students. She's working on a creative writing PhD. She's asking about what is the greatest lesson a prose storyteller can take from the ballads? And that is a form question, I suppose, you know, from a verse genre to a prose genre. And again, I think you sort of touched on that a little bit.
Give me the plot. I mean, the lesson you can take, I think, really does sort of have to do with what's interesting and exciting about these things, despite the fact that for a modern reader, there's no characterization. There's no motivation for all of that. So I guess you could do something interesting with why do we love these stories? And this goes for fairy tale as well, despite the fact that they contain none of the things that make a story to us now.
Yeah, great. I'm really struggling here to pick one last one because there's so many and they're just absolutely great. I'm going to have to be, oh gosh.
We can do something sometime where it's just an hour of Q&A with me.
We should.
Or through Instagram or something. Yeah.
You can't escape that easily. Again, one of our outcoming master students, Ian, is asking, are there any contributions what would you say is the contribution you've made to fantasy that you particularly treasure? You know, that's a tough question, and I would rephrase it as, what would you like to be remembered for? Gosh, that's tough. Sorry, Ellen, you're gonna kill me now.
Okay, no, I've got it. For my prose, throughout all my opuses, I think that's the thing I do best. There are other things that are very hard for me. Prose is something that I cherish in other people's work, good prose, musical prose. And also breaking a lot of barriers, breaking a lot of boundaries.
Perfect. And that's a lovely, lovely place to stop. And thank you ever so much for answering so many questions. We will have to have some sort of follow-up. Do continue this conversation on Twitter as well, and tag the centre, tag Ellen, and we'll see. We'll do the best we can as we go through. Okay, so we are ready now to move to the next part, and this is our panel. So I will now pass on the baton to my colleague Laura Martin, who will introduce the panel and will moderate it. So I will disappear there for a while, but I'll see you again towards the end to close the event. Right, on to Laura.
Hello. Well, I have the honor of introducing people who need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. And it's quite difficult to keep this short because they've done so darned much. So I'm sorry, I'll be speaking for a while. What I'll do is make 3 introductions, and then I have a first question for Terri and Brian and Rob. The same question for all 3. And then if you'll start putting things into the Q&A, I can try to address that. I'm just slightly nervous about that, but I'm sure it will work. So first of all, I'll introduce Dr. Rob Maslen, who spoke to us earlier. It's down to Rob's amazing vision and hard work that we're even here today. For without him, there would be no fantasy in Lit, and the resounding success of which has provided the momentum that led to the hiring of new staff in the field of fantasy, and from there to the establishment of the unique Center for Fantasy and the fantastic that we're celebrating today. Rob is senior lecturer in English literature. He established himself in Renaissance studies, where he published very widely before moving on to the fantastic literature from that era till today. He's written on Flann O'Brien, on Ursula K. Le Guin and her mother, and on Herb Meirles, and many, many more. That's just a tiny summary. Rob has edited or co-edited 2 volumes of poetry, of the poetry of Mervyn Peake, some of which is complete nonsense. His current work seeks to set Peake's work in the context of the rise of fantasy from the 1930s to the 1950s. His prolific contributions to his blog, The City of Lost Books, is a real treat every month, with thoroughly researched and fascinating insights into topics ranging from the Renaissance to the present day, from fake translations to Japanese anime, from novels to artwork to poetry. He has supervised or is supervising some 20 PhDs on topics in Elizabethan literature and the fantastic, and Rob is a powerhouse of creative fun in the School of Critical Studies. This place would be much different without him, less sparkly, less adventurous, less fun. Rob helps to bring serious research and serious fun together. Next, we have Terri Windling. Wow, where do I start? Jane Yolen said of her, quote, "If there is a single person at the nexus of fantasy literature, it is Terri Windling, as editor, as writer, as painter, as muse." Terri has published over 40 books, winning 9 World Fantasy Awards, the Mythopoeic Award for The Wood's Wife, the Bram Stoker Award, and making the shortlist for the Tiptree Award for her collection, The Armis Maiden, which reached out to adult survivors of child abuse. She received the Sci-Fi and Fantasy Writers of America Solstice Award in 2010 for, quote, outstanding contributions to the speculative fiction field as a writer, editor, artist, educator, and mentor. Her work has been translated into French, German, Spanish, Italian, Czech, Russian, Turkish, Korean, and Japanese. Whirlwind Windling has edited more than 30 anthologies of magical fiction, as well as editing for the fantasy line of Ace and Tor books. She has co-edited 16 volumes of the year's best fantasy and horror. She has transformed the publishing world of fantasy fiction, helping to spark a resurgence of fairy tale retellings and novelistic form, and promoting early writers of urban fantasy, such as Charles de Lint and Emma Bull. In her own fiction, she reaches out to all generations, from children to young adults to adults. Her essays on myth, folklore, magical literature, and art have been widely published in newsstand magazines, academic journals, art books, and anthologies, as well as on her blog, Myth and More, Notes from a Dartmoor Studio. As if that weren't enough, Terri is also an artist and a promoter of others' art, with her Endicott Studio, an organization dedicated to myth-inspired arts. Her own artistic work has been exhibited in the US, UK, and France. She was the co-editor of the now defunct The Journal of Mythic Arts, and she currently sits on the board of the Mythic Imagination Institute. Terri's support of and collaborations with the activities surrounding the Inlet and fantasy have been enormously helpful. She was the keynote speaker at the Fantasy Symposium in May 2019. This was a one-day gathering of academics and practitioners at the University of Glasgow and beyond to scope interest in the new centre and inform its direction and initial plan. She is in many, many ways our fairy godmother. Last, but definitely not least, in the stellar lineup, we have Professor Brian Attebery of Idaho State University, who perhaps has done more than anyone to bring science fiction and fantasy studies to the hallowed halls of academia. In 1980, he published The Fantasy Tradition in American Literature from Irving to Le Guin, and there followed in the 4 decades since 4 more monographs in fantasy, science fiction, and myth, as well as numerous articles focusing variously on narrative structure, gender, most recently on masculinities, Disney films, utopias, interdisciplinarity, and more. Brian collaborated with Ursula K. Le Guin and Karen Joy Fowler to edit the groundbreaking Norton Book of Science Fiction in 1998. His 1992 monograph, Strategies of Fantasy, is a kind of Bible for the field. It won him the Mythopoeic Award for Myth and Fantasy Studies. Brian's most recent book, Stories About Stories, Fantasy and the Remaking of Myth, also won him the Mythopoeic Award again. He's been awarded the Distinguished Scholarship Award from the International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts, as well as several other honors. Since the autumn of 2006, Brian has been the editor of the Journal of the Fantastic and the Arts, and since 2016, he's been serving as the editor for the Library of America's fabulous and beautiful republication of the works of Ursula K. Le Guin. We were very lucky to have Brian in Glasgow with us from January through July of 2019 as the Leverhulme Visiting Professor of Fantasy. That was a semester which many of us will never forget, where every few weeks in the dark Scottish winter, we had another gloriously insightful and interesting lecture on science fiction and fantasy topics. He also taught on the IMLIT and nurtured the young, or at least younger, scholars there. Things just haven't been the same for us since Brian and Jennifer went back home. Fortunately, we can recreate the experience in a small way, as the recordings of the 5 public lectures are available on the Centre website link called the Leverhulme Fantasy Lectures on our Centre's website. Whew. So now for the question. I will start with a quote from Rob's blog, and then ask questions first from Rob, and then Terry, and then Brian. And remembering that you can send in your questions to the Q&A as we go. So we'll start with this one. So from Rob's blog, Rob, you say on your blog, The City of Lost Books, that it is named in recognition that fantasy books have been lost to the curriculum since the days when the fantastic got a bad name, somewhere around the time when Plato banished poets from his ideal republic. Fantasy fiction has existed in an alternative dimension, a hidden library, for much of its existence. And the question of how long it has existed is as vexed as any question about a past that has not yet discovered how to right itself. So my question, considering that fantasy fiction and art have always existed, but have generally been disregarded, I wondered whether I could ask each of you to respond to this question of what fantasy is good for, in particular in relation to whichever of the current global crises is your favorite one to obsess about at 3 o'clock in the morning. Maybe the COVID-19 pandemic, the looming collapse of certain Western democracies into fascist states, catastrophic anthropogenic climate change, or good old Brexit, or killer wasps, whatever your favorite is. So can fantastical fictions and art help us to engage effectively with these various crises? If so, how? If not, is it a matter of the orchestra playing as the Titanic goes down? So over to you, Rob, there you are, good. Over to you.
It's a really interesting question. And I suppose I'd like to begin by reminding ourselves of what Ellen said in her talk, which was that fantasy is about writing the personal truth that only the teller knows. So to find out what personal truths tellers have to tell us seems to me to be a vastly important thing to do, especially during times of crisis, when on the whole, strident voices, sort of authoritative voices, authoritarian voices tend to be the ones that get heard. fantasy seems to me to give a medium to enable the quieter voices, the marginal voices to speak, very often by disguising themselves in a pretty radical way. So you could look back to Aesopic fable, for instance, told by a slave to tell truth to power, very often disguising everything under fables of animals and human beings in conversation. Everyone knew that generally human beings and animals don't have conversations like that, but by reading them we can discover a huge amount about the condition of living as a slave under the supposedly sort of cultural heights of Greek civilization. And so you look through the history of fantasy, and you'll find that it's so often written at times of great emotional and political stress and trauma. So you'll see magnificent fantasies emerging, for instance, out of the antebellum period of slavery in the southern states of America, written by writers like Charles Chestnut in his tales of his Conjure Woman tales in the late 19th century. Or you'll find an amazing outpouring of fantasy that's emerged out of the Great War, including Tolkien's works, C.S. Lewis's works, a whole range of others. Trauma seems very often to be the moment at which people are triggered to write in styles which draw on what's palpably different from what they've gone through. And in doing so, they're freed and liberated to speak words which otherwise they would find it perhaps impossible to speak.
What a fabulous answer. Thank you very much. Very enlightening. So Terri, you have used your creative work, amongst other things, to reach out to troubled children, as well as survivors of child abuse. And you are an educator as well as a writer, artist, and editor, so many things. So what is your perspective on the uses of enchantment?
So when you say the uses of enchantment, that is a phrase that specifically relates to fairy tales and folk tales. Fantasy is a literature, as I think most of us would agree, that has its roots in the old storytelling tradition, that is myth, that is heroic fables, that is the great epic of nations, but also the humble folklore and folk tales and fairy tales of every, from around the world, have gone into that soup of story that Tolkien talks about, that we draw upon when we're writing fantasy today. And part of my particular interest in the fantasy field has long been those quieter, smaller stories, not the great battles of the gods in myth and epic, but the domestic stories of fairy tales, the small personal quests that are made, the small personal transformations that are made when a fairy tale hero or a folktale hero goes into the deep, dark woods, faces monsters, faces their own inner demons, and is either destroyed or transformed by the story's end, and often by going through that transformation, transform the world around them. I'm very interested in the kind of, there's so many different kinds of fantasy we can be talking about tonight, but I'm particularly interested in the kinds of fantasy that come out of folklore and fairy tale, and that talk about personal transformation or societal transformation, that talk about the quest into the deep, dark forest, facing the dark and coming out of it, and how you come out of it, and what happens to you when you come out of it. I think that fantasy is a really wonderful tool, like poetry, for talking about things that are sometimes very hard to put into words otherwise. And there's the Gwyn has a wonderful quote, which unfortunately I don't have with me, where she talks about how fantasy is closer to poetry than realistic fiction is. It's closer to mysticism and madness than realistic fiction is, that it is a quest and it is dangerous and it will change you. And no one should go into that quest feeling too safe, which I truly believe. So when you asked about my working with fairy tales and writers who are using fairy tales to talk about such dark subjects as child abuse or domestic violence or racism or homophobia or the various things that we talk about today. Why would we want to go to this poetic language to tell stories about those things rather than simply sticking with realism? I think, as Ellen was saying, we can get to truths slantwise that we can't get to directly. And fantasy is a very gorgeous, gorgeous tool for that. I want to read something Jane Yolen wrote, which absolutely speaks to this. Where is it? She says, for adults, the world of fantasy books returns us to the great words of power, which in order to be tamed, we have excised from our adult vocabularies. These words are the pornography of innocence, words which adults no longer use with other adults, and so we laugh at them and consign them to the nursery, fear masking as cynicism. These are the words that were forged in the earth, air, fire, and water of human existence, and the words are love, hate, good, evil, courage, honor, truth. Fantasy allows us to talk about these very big things in an age where irony is king. Wearing your heart on your sleeve, talking about these big heartfelt things is simply not cool. But through the language of fantasy, we can address them slantwise. And these things matter more than ever during times of crisis. You know, it's no accident that Tolkien's great epic came out of his experiences of World War I and World War II. It's no accident that Alan Garner's work and Susan Cooper's work and a lot of the post-war fantasists, you know, grew up during World War II, where good and evil were played out in their childhoods in a very, very real way. Whether it's a small domestic battle of good and evil coming out of an abusive childhood, or the larger battle of good and evil that we're going through now, where Black children are being shot on city streets in America, where, you know, the terrible things we're going through here. And the biggest thing of all, my nightmare, is, of course, climate change. Not only do we have the tools to address those big subjects through the language of metaphor and fantasy, I think we have the obligation. If we can't talk about those things in fantasy, who can? But with any kind of magic, I mean, language itself is magical. You think of the old bards, the old Anglo-Saxon magicians, the old Celtic magicians. They were using poetry to cast spells. The language we use to tell our story is itself a magical act in the way that it takes our stories and puts them into somebody else's thoughts and mingles with those thoughts and becomes something new inside of them. Because we're using these deep and ancient tools of metaphor, of symbolism, of myth, which are very powerful magics, I think that we have an obligation to use them wisely, to be careful of the language we use, be careful of the stories we're telling, and make sure these are monsters we really want to loosen to the world, particularly a world that already has quite a lot to contend with. Fantasy to me is a way of creating the world we want to live in. It's a way of discussing the worlds we've come out of and what that has done to us, what we can take from it and transform ourselves with, transform our societies with. I can't think of anything more vital than that in this terrible time.
Thank you. It's very touching, and you know, words like both of you so far, now on to Brian, it makes it seem possible. It gives one hope when one speaks the way that you speak. So I want to thank you, especially that's very, very touching. So last but definitely not least again, Brian, with your magisterial knowledge of a century of science fiction and fantasy, this means that you have a near complete overview of how these genres have functioned in the past. And of course, you've already heard a bit about that. But what does this tell you, or whatever, however you want to address this question, about where things are heading now and what we can do with fantasy fiction?
Well, I will deny being a magister, maybe a journeyman. So I don't dare make a prediction. but I was thinking about the trajectory that fantasy has been taking over the last few decades. And because I tend to think in weird metaphors, the way riddles see the world in metaphor, slant-wise, as Terri was saying, I made up a metaphor here, and it's a weird one. So bear with me while I set it up. Imagine you've come into a classroom, you're getting ready to write on a whiteboard, and you discover that somebody before you has written in permanent marker. The eraser is useless. You don't know what sorts of toxic chemicals you might need to remove that old writing. But here is a teacher's trick that often works. Take your dry erase marker and go over the marks that are there. Rewrite what's there. Scribble over it. The dry erase ink will loosen up the old writing. And then you can remove it or alter it or write something completely new. I think of cultural narratives as things that are written in permanent marker. They're on the board when we come into the room. All the meta-narratives, as Jean-François Lyotard called them. These are the stories of power and desire and identity that tell us what we can be. Realism can explore those grand narratives and even attack them, but it usually ends up reinscribing them in the process. But fantasy can take something like gender or race or a Cartesian self and unwrite the story. It takes the master plot and turns it into just another fantasy trope, something conditional, something erasable. It scribbles right through the meta-narratives and shows us that they are always the stuff of fantasy. So I see this happening in contemporary fantasies by writers like N.K. Jemisin, Charlie Jane Anders, Zen Cho, or Andrea Hairston. These, I think, are writers who don't recognize themselves in the standard narratives of authority and identity, and so they do write over them. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy reinscribes, for instance, Jehovah as a grief-maddened Earth Father, and that way she overwrites the histories of exploitation of people and environments. Anders retells the Harry Potter budding wizard story in a way that undoes all of the hierarchies and all of the inevitabilities that J.K. Rowling built into her world. Zen Cho's Sorcerer to the Crown is a Regency romance that slyly undercuts both Regency, or that is Eurocentric authority, and romance, the marriage plot as a kind of colonization. In Redwood and Wildfire and the sequels, Hairston reminds us of the terrible historical narratives of violence and oppression that made America. But she also offers magical ways around and under and through those scenarios. So fantasy, this kind of fantasy, isn't escapism, but dry eraserism. That's where I start.
That's where you start. Fabulous, fabulous. Do any of you want to respond to what the others have said, first of all? Any interchanges between you? No.
I love that.
Yeah.
And it also reminded me the whole idea of writing on top of what's gone before. Also, another way to look at that is in the fantasy field, we write on top of we're in conversation with books historically that have been published in our field. And those conversations are sometimes homage. Those conversations are sometimes angry, like, I'm going to change this because you have all these wrong, old-fashioned, old generation ideas about what this or that or this or that, and so my generation is going to do fantasy this way. And but that dialogue, that this chain of writers from the storytellers at the dawn of the time up through 19th century and early 20th century and mid 20th century fantasists, and then those of us who were working beginning in the 80s, and then the new writers today. As Ellen was saying in her speech, we all stand on each other's shoulders, and the conversations that we're having from work to work, from book to book, is a glorious one. And one of the things that I love about where fantasy is going is that some of the younger writers are absolutely scribbling out some of the things, even things that from my generation are very dear to my heart. But first I gulp and think, oh, and then I look at it and yes, that's what we did. That's what we did to the generations past us. We were in dialogue with them, we honored them, but we also railed against them. And all of the writers you mentioned, I love for precisely that, because they're looking at fantasy tropes and going, I love this, but I also hate it, and I'm going to turn it upside down.
Yeah, and you can even do it to your own writing. And I think that's what Le Guin did midway through Earthsea.
Yeah, I have a real pet peeve with people who stop after the first 3 books. You do not know Earthsea if you only read the first 3 books. That's exactly what she does.
Exactly. Rob, did you have something?
Yeah, one of the things I think that's most powerful about modern fantasy, and indeed maybe fantasy through most of its evolution, is that it often, most fantasy, I think, is a kind of collision between genres and modes and styles. So you have vividly present on the page obvious archaisms. You know, the fact that you have swords people in a period when, you know, the reader is living in a world of high technology. And yet they're speaking like people that the reader is familiar with from their own world. So there's a kind of a clash of values and cultures and ways of speaking and so forth, made more vividly present by the fantastic context. And I think that's one of the reasons why fantasy works so well to achieve the various effects, the political techniques and the activism that both Terri and Brian have been speaking of.
Fabulous. Okay, there are lots of questions here. There's one here that a certain individual who's deigned to join us, named Lord Elrond of Rivendell, which is quite surprising, has said, it sounds as if everyone is hinting that fantasy is essentially destructive, that it seeks to change what's there and replace it with something better, a literature of subversion, as Jackson might call it. Isn't this very different than the way the foundational figures of fantasy, MacDonald, Tolkien, etc., would have seen it? What about Colin Manlove's thesis that fantasy comes from a delight in being? I have to say, I don't think you were talking about destruction, but it's an interesting question nevertheless, because I think you were talking about creation, but perhaps that's a question. Oh, sorry, I should say maybe Brian first, if you'd like.
Yeah, I was thinking about when Ellen was talking, and she talked so eloquently about how she used ballads and traditional songs and the imagery from those. She didn't talk so much about riddles, which is the other half of that novel. And I know she has thought a lot about that. I recommend, if you can find her Sound and Spirit program about riddles, it's brilliant. But a riddle doesn't ever tell you anything straight out. Instead, it teaches you how to think a different way, a kind of indirect way, the Elfland road that winds. And I think maybe that's part of what we're talking about here with fantasy and the trauma and world change and so on. Fantasy's not going to just report on those. It doesn't do it as well as other forms do, but it does set up riddles and make you think through them. And riddles are great for lateral thinking, for I cannot get there from here, but maybe if I go around, I'll find my way to it. So that's the way I would think of it.
Yeah, so that we're active participants and not just getting something fed to us. Yeah. Rob, do you have a response to that? question about is it destructive and not the delight in being?
Well, there's a huge amount of destruction in the world. It's not something that fantasy can shy away from. Fantasy represents destruction very often in very vivid and very kind of memorable and emotionally seizing ways. But it seems to me that also fantasy is crucially about creation emerging from the, if you like, as much as anything else, the assembled broken pieces of what's been destroyed, so putting it back together in new forms and giving hope for a future which can be built out of the fragments of a destroyed past. So yeah, I think it's an immensely creative and energizing form. Otherwise, I think none of us would delight in it the way we do. And I certainly think it's concerned with being, but being is not a passive state. Being is a constantly evolving condition, and you know, many of those periods of evolution are very painful, as we've found in emerging into the new the new way of being that COVID-19 has forced on us, for example. Am I the first to mention that? Anyway. Yes, I think it's a creative process, but it has to acknowledge and emerge from the fragments of destruction.
Yes, okay, good. Terri, did you have a response?
Well, fantasy is a very, very broad field. Anything you can say about one type of fantasy book or one individual fantasy book, you can say the opposite about another type of fantasy or another book. We were specifically responding to a question about fantasy addressing the nightmares of today.
Yes.
So of course, we were talking about the fantasies that are challenging that, investigating that, reflecting that. There is also a strain of fantasy that is about the delight of being, the magic in the landscape, the magic inherent in the world. It happens to be a form of fantasy I quite love. And for me, that is not escapist as opposed to the more challenging works being the tougher, more literary things. A love of the natural world, of life, of the numinous quality of life, I think is also part of what we need right now in the middle of catastrophe, in the middle of climate change, in the middle of war and famine and refugee struggles. And you cannot have the dark without the light. You cannot have the quest into the dark without the emergence, as Rob says. And the books that celebrate the magic of the world are, for me, not only a wonderful part of fantasy, but equally important.
Yes, okay, yeah. I think also, you know, question was about destruction, and you can't have new life without something being destroyed. And as you've all spoken about how fantasy has changed, you know, taking the previous generations and doing something new, because there always has to be something new. And you've all spoken so well about that. Perhaps leading on from what Terri has just said about the environment being one of the big issues, and maybe the main one for you. Someone has asked the question, says Dion Dobrinsky, at a time of urgent ecological crisis, how might fantasy fiction be mobilized to engage audiences in real environments? So I guess asking for a real sort of hands-on. In particular, I'm interested in how forest ecology is represented in fantasy fiction, including by Morris, Tolkien, and Le Guin. Do you recommend any other fantasy writers who pay particular attention to forests in their work? So that's kind of a particular question, but I don't know if anybody has an answer. That's probably Terri first would be probably most in your line if there's.
Yes, and of course, the minute somebody asks me that, they all go out of my head.
Yes. Yeah.
Charles DeLint has written a lot about forests. Robert Holdstock. There's a beautiful children's fantasy called The Girl Who Speaks Bear by Sophie Anderson out right now that is stunning on the subject of forests. There's a wonderful book by Sarah Maitland, nonfiction, called Gossip from the Forest, which is looking at fairy tales in relation to the forest, that has inspired a number of writers of fiction. I think there is a lot of forests weaving through the fantasy scape always, you know, from Tolkien onwards. To me, I do agree that it is important, the kind of fantasy that I'm really interested in this intersection between fantasy and nature writing, where, where there are some fantasists who may not see themselves as nature writers, but certainly the landscape is as much a character in their work as any of the characters. Molly Goss's Wildlife is another one of those. Alan Gardner's work is always like that. And I think that those books are particularly important ecologically speaking, because we need to, in a world where so many people are disconnected from the land beneath their feet, we need to re-enchant the world. We talk about rewilding landscapes. I think we need to restore them. I think we need to have a sense of mystery and wonder about the land around us, and to be in awe of it again, to treasure it again as the first step into defending it, taking care of it, seeing the trees and our non-human neighbors as not resources to exploit, but as fellow beings on this earth with us.
Yeah.
So stories of that sort in fantasy is something I'm actually starting to really explore at the moment. So that was a very good question.
Yeah. Well, the chat seems to agree with you. A very good answer as well. Good.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Oh,
go on. Go for
I
it.
wanted to take off from Terri by pointing out that she herself used a very different landscape of the desert Southwest. And there are a lot of wonderful forests, and they're very, they're archetypal, but I think part of what fantasy can do is do exactly the same thing for other ecosystems. And I say that as somebody who lives in what is called a sagebrush steppe. And my favorite description of what a sagebrush steppe is like is a biologist I read, and I can't remember her name now, said, "I've stopped thinking of this as a desert. Instead, it is a very short forest." And if you know the kind of landscape I'm talking about, if you change your perspective and change your sense of proportion, it is exactly that, with an upper story and an understory and everything that a forest has. And I think that there is an opening for fantasy writers to do more of that. And this is a challenge because often you end up having to work your way through the issues of cultural appropriation because somebody else has written the mythic or spoken the mythic stories about those landscapes. They are not the European traditions that we've got. And you don't just say, okay, I'm going to now tell the Paiute story about this landscape or the Australian Aboriginal one, but you have to look at them and give honor to them and to the people who told those at the same time that you're telling the ecological narrative about these other landscapes.
Brian, you bring up, do you mind my jumping in?
Go ahead.
I haven't heard from Rob yet. Just briefly, you bring up something that I've been thinking about lately, which is, it's not just the land underfoot, but the whole concept of what is home has changed so much in the modern world. There are more of us living in cities than in countryside across the planet for the first time in history. Certainly in the West, there are a shrinking, vanishing number of people who will live and die on the land where their people were for generations. We have become a very migratory species. We always have been, of course, but to the degree that we have now, and then climate change is going to cause even more mass migration and more wars and more famines and more people on the move. So what does it mean when those of us who are also ecologists are saying, we need to connect to the land, we need to understand our watersheds, we need to write these, as David Abrams says, write the language of the earth into our fiction. What does that mean for all of us who are immigrants on our land? And I think that's a story that we need to start telling too, is what does home mean? How do we go to a place that we haven't farmed for generations, and we may only be here for 2 years and go somewhere else because that's how modern life is. How do we go there and tell stories of that place with respect? How do we integrate with respect? It's a huge thing to be addressing, but story is one way to do it.
So Rob, in the dark.
Yeah, I'm getting dark. I think I love what both Brian and Terri have said. I love also the essay by Tolkien on fairy stories, which every time I read it, I think I discover something new in it, and I think it's the fons et origo, the taproot of everything one can say about fantasy in a lot of ways. But he uses a concept, the idea of recovery. And I love the notion, the idea that what fantasy is supremely good at is recovering things for us, bringing us back to quite simple things. And he uses, I think, trees as an example, which we've forgotten to look at and forgotten to pay close and important attention to. But the notion of recovery is being transformed in many ways by modern fantasy, as both Terri and Brian have pointed out. It's recovery of traditions that have been overwritten by the erasure of colonial thinking, for example. People coming into a land and kind of writing out the materials that had been used to write the land before. I think Le Guin is the other great tree and forest writer. As she herself said, there are some people who, when they became human beings, came out of the woods and went wandering across the plains. But she added, some of us are still up there swinging. So I think I would go to her both for a discovery about the way woods and trees and so on exist. There's a very wonderful short story of hers in her collection, The Wind's 12 Quarters, which is about an empath. It's a science fiction story, a man who can sort of emote, who can share the emotions of other species and other beings around the universe. And he finds himself sharing the emotions of a planet which is entirely made up of a forest, which is just a single plant, effectively. So it's a beautiful story, but it's also a very important kind of little allegory of the way we understand and respond to the ecology around us. The other thing that she did was to begin the process of writing back, of recovering the story of California, which had been lost with the lost Californian native peoples. So many of whom had been erased by disease and murder and all sorts of other things, and wrote it afresh in this extraordinary futuristic utopia she wrote called Always Coming Home. Tolkien and Le Guin still remain the people I go back to, but we're moving forward from them at a very rapid pace, and it's wonderful to see.
Yes, interesting.
Yeah, speaking of Le Guin, there's a category of books that I think of as fantasy adjacent. And one of those that I read recently is Robert Macfarlane's, is it Underland? Yeah. In which he cites that Le Guin story as he's exploring how forest ecosystems work under the ground. And she already had it in there. I mean, she mythicized it before the scientists described it. So I do recommend Robert's book.
The story is called Vaster Than Empires. So it's another Marvel reference to add to Ellen's during her talk.
A far less comfortable view of forests in this. Rob Holdstock Mythaga Wood series is justly a classic, but it's not a pastoral. It's a pretty dark journey into the wildness of nature, but that's nature too. And Tolkien, in that wonderful essay Rob cites, says that the fairy stories, and by extension fantasy, don't require happy endings. But they require miraculous grace.
Oh, fabulous.
So we can go to some dark places with fantasy, and still be bringing things up to the surface that are worth bringing, that are not just loosing more monsters, that are showing us aspects of the world that are part of who we are, part of what nature is, part of what our relationship with nature is.
I want to just put in a plug for a fantasy series that does exactly what Terri was talking about, and Rob as well, and that's Laurie Marks.
Yes.
Her air logic, fire logic, and so on, because it is all about migration,
yes,
and invasion, and becoming part of the new space that you have moved into.
Yeah, and should be so much better known. She's
Yeah.
one of our great writers. And this series, which you can find from Small Beer Press, all 4 books, should be treasured as a classic because it is really quite stunning.
Well, I'm mindful of the time. We're actually at the end of the time, unless Dimitri wants to give us more. I want to just say that the other questions that were there, several people asking for a reading list. So maybe that's something we could put on the center, I'm not sure. Somebody wanted your Jane Yolen quote, Terri. So I don't know how we can get that to somebody, the reference for the Yolen quote that you had.
I can send it to you and you can put it on somewhere on the center site.
Do that. And people asking about how to teach fantasy. And there was a post-colonial question that I didn't get to and a few other ones. But it's been so rich and so wonderful. And as I say, it gives one hope for humanity despite everything. So thank you so much. Thank you.
You can.
Oh, thank you, everyone. This is very tough. This is very tough because if it was completely up to me, I'd let you speak for another half hour. No problem. Hours, actually. The same with Ellen. It's ruthless to have to stop it here, but we have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this webinar will kick us out at some point. So I think this is the point where this is a good point to wrap up. And thank you, Laura, for chairing, and to all the panelists. So I want to close with a couple of and Ellen, if you want to show your video as well so we can see you at the end, that would be nice. So I'm going to share a few quick announcements before thanking everyone. I'll try and share my screen again. Oh gosh, let's see how that's going to go. Yes. Yes, okay, hopefully you can see this. Yeah, so I want to talk very briefly about a couple of forthcoming events, and just to let you know that these are only the events I can talk about at the moment, because we're cooking up a lot of things that aren't quite finalized, so I'm not allowed to sort of mention them yet, but these are the ones that are certainly, definitely, absolutely happening. So there's going to be a lecture on Halloween and folklore in October. I think we're looking at the 28th, and it's going to be by my old tutor and the person who taught me everything I know about folklore, and that is Dr. Juliet Wood from Cardiff University, and she's been chosen a folklore society sort of chairperson for a long, long time. There'll be more on that on the website and an Eventbrite to book and all of these things. There's also going to be an event to celebrate the centenary of David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, which is a cult text, one of the earliest Scottish sort of science fiction fantasy texts, which is 100 years old this year. So it's just the right time to be celebrating it, and we're just at the right place to be celebrating it. And that will be with scholar Douglas A. Anderson, who's worked with the David Lindsay estate, with Professor Bob Davies, who I believe is right here with us watching at the moment, and with science fiction author Nina Allen, who has engaged with Arcturus in her writing. Again, more details on that with dates, times, and a link to book as in the next couple of weeks. The other two things that are definitely happening is GIFCON. GIFCON is our annual postgraduate fantasy conference. It's been going on for a few years now. Sadly, because of COVID, we did have to cancel the last one because it was all supposed to happen just as everything was falling to pieces in the world. But we are going to bring back last year's theme, Beyond the Anglo-Centric Fantastic. So touching on a lot of things that our panelists were talking about before. So there'll be more information on that soon, especially to those people who already had papers accepted. And we won't put you through that process again, don't worry. We'll be in touch with more information. And that we're looking at the end of April for that. And finally, there is a session on medieval world building, specifically on Tolkien, his precursors and legacies, at the International Medieval Congress at Kalamazoo, Michigan, in May 2021, hosted by us and with a panel of some of our PhD students and scholars from elsewhere as well. As I said, there are other things being cooked up that I really want to tell you right now, but I can't. So if you want to receive our news, clearly you can follow us on Twitter or the Facebook group, and we will be posting things there. But if you want to be the first to hear, if you want to receive our news via email, please either drop us a line at the email address you see on the screen now, or send us a message via our blog. And remember, there are two sites. There is the website where the forthcoming events will be, and then there's the blog where we keep it more up to date. So there's two links there. Again, all of that is on our Twitter page too. So all that remains for me to do now is just to, again, thank everyone so much. Can I first of all thank Ellen Kushner for that absolutely amazing, goosebump-raising talk. And our panelists, Terri Windling, Brian Attebery, and Rob Maslen, for a brilliant discussion on so many topics. And I suppose that all of the stuff we heard today are sparks for other events, other discussions, other research, other topics, other PhDs. You know, there's so much that went on today. Can I also thank everyone who joined us tonight from all over the world, all of you that joined us on Zoom, all of you that joined us on YouTube. It's been an absolute joy to see, especially at the beginning of the event, see where you're all joining us from at the moment. So thank you for being here and for following us. And watch this space for all the stuff, all the exciting stuff that is to come. Last thanks again to the University of Glasgow for letting us do this crazy thing, and to the School of Critical Studies, especially for being the host of the centre. Right, that's it, folks, I think. So time for a final wave. Goodbye from everyone, and thank you so much for being with us. Goodbye.